Hi, I'm Carissa Véliz, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Carrie Parker, and today we have episode 404 for November 25th, 2024. First of all, quick happy Thanksgiving to everybody here in the U.S. I know that it's celebrated at different times elsewhere. But anyway, just want to say happy Thanksgiving to everybody here in the U.S. Also, this is the time of year when I update my Give Thanks and Donate blog post. It's a good time of year to think about donating to organizations that are out there fighting for our digital rights every day. And so I keep that updated. I just updated it for this year. If you go to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons and look for the Give Thanks and Donate, you'll have to search for it because by editing it doesn't bring it to the top of the list. But if you search for Give Thanks and Donate, you'll find it. Of course, there's a link in the show notes as well. And I call it organizations like the Electronic Privacy Information Center and the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Center for Democracy and Technology and Fight for the Future and several other organizations that are doing amazing work 24/7, 365. And if you want to support the cause of privacy and security and other digital rights, but don't have the time to do much about it yourself, well, then give money to these organizations and consider giving maybe an ongoing donation. Also, just FYI, for those of you flocking to Blue Sky, I do have a Blue Sky account. You can find me at firewalldragons.bsky.social. I'm not really understanding why there's this massive move. It's something to do with the election. I don't honestly care. But anyway, I do know that a lot of people are going to Blue Sky, and I do have a presence there. I try to have a presence on most of the major socials, even though I don't like social media in general. But I know that's where people are, and I know I need to get the word out about certain things, and so I am there. If you want to go to fdsd.me/contacts, you will find a list of all my social media accounts if you want to follow me. Okay, so today we have a magnificent interview. We are talking with Carissa Véliz, author of the book Privacy is Power. Now, this book came out a little over 3 years ago, and I saw it announced like 4 years ago, probably on social media somewhere. I'd never heard of Carissa at the time, but I saw this book, read the blurb, and I'm like, wow, that's going to be an amazing book. I reached out to Carissa even before I had read it and said, hey, I'd love to get you on my show. This looks like a great book, and I would love to talk to you about it. And at the time, it was like, yeah, sure, let's do that. But, it's kind of busy. And actually, it came out in the UK first. And so it wasn't going to come out in the US for another several months. And I wanted to read the book first. So we kind of put it off and, waiting for me to have a chance to actually read the book before we did the interview. And then, things happened. Carissa was extremely busy. The book was very, very popular. I mean, I've seen her on all sorts of interviews and conference speaking gigs and things. And for various reasons, it just didn't quite work out until now. It has been a long time coming, but man, it does not disappoint. I was so happy to talk with Carissa. She brings such a fresh perspective to this topic. I mean, after all, she is a professor of philosophy at Oxford. So it's different than the usual tech angle on privacy. And the book, by the way, you've got to read the book. I'll say more about it, after the interview, but it's very approachable and yet very poignant. And even if you are a privacy believer, I'm telling you, you will learn from this book and find new and interesting perspectives, just like I did when I read the book. I really don't do a lot of book reviews on my blog. At that time that book came out, I think I'd only done one other one, but I felt compelled to do one for Carissa's book. And you can read that too. There's a link in the show notes, my review of the book. But it does not take the place of reading it. You definitely need to read it yourself. But I tell you what, instead of talking about this book, why don't we go straight to the source and talk to Carissa Véliz, the author of Privacy is Power. Carissa Véliz is an associate professor in philosophy at the Institute for Ethics in AI and a fellow at the Hertford College at the University of Oxford. She's the author of the highly acclaimed Privacy is Power, as well as the Ethics of Privacy and Surveillance. She's a popular keynote speaker, and she advises companies and policymakers around the world on privacy and the ethics of AI. I've been wanting to have you on the show, as you well know, for many years. Thank you so much for coming on for the interview.
Thank you so much for having me, Carrie. It's a real privilege.
As you well know, I loved your book. I'm really excited to talk about it. There's no way we're going to get through all of it today, but I want to kind of do is cover some related topics. It's a very, very powerful book, and I've got a review that you can read. I'll put a link in the show notes. The main one I want to start with is, why did you write the book? Was there a precipitating event? And how did your background in philosophy and ethics influence your approach to this topic?
So first of all, thank you so much for that review. I really appreciate it. And it's very special for a writer to feel so understood by a reader, and to have that connection is really magic. And I think that's why writers write, and that's why we also read as readers. And I think I wrote the book mainly out of frustration and concern. I started writing my dissertation on the ethics of privacy, and at the beginning I didn't feel very strongly about it, even though I've always been a person who cares more about privacy than maybe the average. I hadn't realized all the political implications. And in fact, at the beginning, the project was about the ethics of privacy, and very quickly it became about the ethics and politics of privacy. And one of the things that bothered me is that I couldn't find the book that I wanted to read. Some books were good on the legal aspects, some books were good on identifying the practical challenges, but there wasn't a book that really put things together. And especially, I was very disappointed with the literature on privacy, partly because it's not very extensive. If you compare it to the literature on justice or on autonomy in philosophy, there's very little on privacy. And most of it was very outdated, such that it clearly did not apply to the age of the digital. And my first idea was to write an academic book, which ended up being The Ethics of Privacy and Surveillance, which I published this year with Oxford University Press. But as I started to write the book, I thought, this is a topic that's too important for politics, for democracy, to only be an academic book that mostly gets read by people in universities. I wanted to write a book that anyone could read, and particularly the people who were more skeptical, people who think, well, I have nothing to hide. Why should I care about privacy?
So I'm curious, it's been about a little over 3 years, I think, since it came out. What sort of impact has the book had? And has there been any particular responses that has surprised you?
I'm going to go back a little bit, because you asked why it matters, or how philosophy influenced me. And I think that's a really good question that I didn't address. One of the reasons I love philosophy is because it gives you the chance to go back to the very basic questions, or questions that seem basic, but are very difficult to answer and very important. And one of the things I tell my students is to appreciate the time given to think about the big questions of life, like how should we ought to live, and what is a good life, and how do we get there? Because most of my students will never again in their lives have the time to think about only that. They'll have different jobs and families, and so I consider myself very privileged to be able to think about what matters and what might other people not be seeing because we're too distracted with different things. I consider that my job, to kind of focus on the things that somebody working as an accountant or a barber or a lawyer might not be seeing, because we're also overwhelmed with daily life. And one very important question is, why is privacy important for human beings in general, but also for democracy? And eventually, I think my work has focused on the question, how much surveillance can democracy take? So 3 years later, I was very surprised by many different kinds of responses. I expected much more criticism towards the book. And my first very pleasant reaction was that it was an Economist Book of the Year. And that was fantastic, because The Economist is known to be a publication that is very mainstream, that is very pragmatic. And even though readers from The Economist probably ended up disagreeing with me, that they took the argument seriously, that they considered it, and that they thought it was important enough to put it there and to debate it, was an incredible surprise. And for good and bad, 3 years later, I stand by every word of the book. And that's great in one sense, because a writer doesn't want the book to become old too quickly. But it's bad in another sense, because we haven't gotten much better in protecting privacy. There are some things that have become a bit better. There are some things that have become worse. But basically, we're still in this very important fight to protect privacy in the digital age.
Well, you opened the book with a sort of a day in the life example of data collection, which I thought was a very effective way to kind of show how we're being tracked mercilessly in just our average everyday lives. So I'm curious, as you researched all the ways that we're tracked in our daily lives, what were some of the most mind-blowing revelations that you found? And then, since you've written the book, have you discovered more types of widespread surveillance that either have come up since or that you missed in the first round of the book?
Yeah, I didn't miss much, I think, in the first round of the book, but there have been new developments in surveillance, for sure. Like, for example, we're seeing more and more sophisticated glasses, similar to Google Glass, but smaller, and for which it's not obvious that you are being surveilled.
Right.
Some of the most surprising examples were how much data cars are collecting on people. And this has recently come up again because Mozilla had an investigation and they published, and all the newspapers published about it. And now some car companies have been sued. But we knew this. We've known this for a while. And it's interesting how long it takes for things to change and for bad practices to be challenged. Another example that I found very surprising was audio beacons. This technology that gets emitted with music from radio or music in the stores in which we buy products, and that our phones record even if we can't listen to them. And that way, companies triangulate and make sense of who listened to an ad and then went to buy the product to the store. I thought that was incredibly creepy. The use of stingrays as well. So stingrays are these vacuums of data that can be used by police, for instance, in protests or near police stations or near government buildings. But one of the scary things is how private individuals can use them too. And in fact, some of the scariest examples I've never published because I find them so scary and so easy to misuse that I don't want to make them well known.
Well, simultaneously, I mean, I've been doing this for a little while, and part of me realizes that when these things get more nationwide attention, they all of a sudden pop up on people's radar. Like, this has been going on for years. And like you said, with some of cars have been invading our privacy for a long time, and they've been recording analytics and things that have been used against us for a while. But, all it takes is, Kashmir Hill in the New York Times to publish a story. And all of a sudden it's widespread. But then on the flip side, the other thing that bothers me is when that hit, and there's been some lawsuits, but it just still doesn't feel like the response to that has been, and what I would hope it would have been by the general populace. Like, there hasn't been this massive uproar. Do you struggle with that same thing?
Of course. And I think the reason is that ultimately we're not challenging the business model. We're still thinking that, this is a bad practice, but we can patch it up and fix it. No, as long as the business model is to sell personal data, we will come up against bad practices time and again. It's the business model that's toxic.
So how did we get here? When did the companies start, as you put it, turning digital exhaust into gold dust? I mean, we've been watching ads for centuries, but when did they start watching us?
So like any story, it's a bit of a simplification because there were many companies and there were many individuals that were thinking about these issues. But basically, it was largely thanks to Google that the data economy really took off. So Google was, on the one hand, a very successful startup in that it had improved search dramatically, and it was very popular with users. However, it was a very unsuccessful startup in that it didn't have a successful business model. It didn't have a way to sustain itself. And investors had been pouring money into it for years and were getting pretty impatient. And there's this one anecdote of an investor who had invested a lot of money, and in exchange, he got what he called the most expensive T-shirt ever. And so Google felt under pressure to do something. And even though their founders were very aware of the ethical problems of relying on ads, they couldn't come up with anything better. They just didn't have the imagination. They felt trapped, and so they ended up doing what they didn't want to do, what they said they wouldn't do, which was relying on ads. Exactly. And not only any kind of ads. It wasn't only ads, it was personalized ads. So they figured that their competitive advantage was that they could use all of these searches that say a lot about people. We search for what we want, we search for what we fear, we search for what keeps us up at night, and use it to give companies access to people and to give information to companies about what people desire, what they fear, how they're vulnerable, and to use that for the purposes of ads.
We kind of break this down into behavioral versus contextual ads. And contextual ads are what we're used to, where, if you want to reach housewives, you put an ad in Good Housekeeping. If you want to reach old guys, you put stuff in football magazines, where you know the rough demographics of the audience, and then you place your ads accordingly. And now the behavioral ads are all around knowing as much about each individual person as possible and targeting those ads. And I think the irony of the whole thing is that, and Cory Doctorow kind of alludes to this with his enshittification ideas, is that the companies that are gathering all this data and giving us all these ads are really the ones making the money. I think I've seen lots of, and I'm curious to know how much you know about this, but I've seen studies that say basically the people making the money on this are not the companies that are doing the advertising. They're not making, if they're paying twice as much for targeted ads, they're not getting twice as much revenue back. Google is.
Exactly. There's so many ironies in this field. So that's one. It's estimated that a targeted ad will sell about 4% more, but sometimes it costs as much as 98% more than a contextual ad. And at the same time, there's lots of fraud, because if you bought an ad, say in the 1980s, you would buy an ad from a newspaper, and then on Sunday you could buy the newspaper and check whether the ad was there. But today, you're buying ads that you can't possibly check, because you're buying ads for people across the world who have a different demographics than you do. And so you're just trusting that the ad will be seen.
Yeah, true.
But for all kinds of reasons, including ad blockers, but also just fraud, middlemen who sell ads, who are actually never going to show those ads. It's estimated that about half of ads that are bought online never have the intended audience or an audience at all. So we're building this surveillance architecture, presumably because it's very profitable. Even that is a bad argument, because stealing is profitable as well, and that's not reason enough to legalize it. And then you're right, the people who are getting rich are not even the companies advertising. They are these tech companies that built this system to sustain themselves. So there are some people who argue that even if you didn't object to privacy, you should object to personalized ads, because they're creating a financial bubble. And one of the interesting stories about how this system came about is that the people who built the auction system for ads were the same people who built the market for subprime mortgages. And both markets suffer from the same disadvantages, one of them being that they're very opaque, like we talked about. So even for reasons completely above and beyond privacy, we should be very scared of these personalized ads, because they're creating a financial bubble. When advertisers realize that they're paying for something that's totally not worth it, it's gonna come down, or at least that's what some people argue.
These companies often claim that they anonymize and aggregate our data to protect our privacy. Is it possible to do this properly and retain the financial and competitive advantages of all this collected information? I mean, do we know of any companies that are actually doing it right?
It's hard to answer the question, partly because researchers don't have full access to what companies are doing. We just have to trust their word for it, mostly. There are some companies that are more open source, that share more information, and it seems like in some cases, some companies are using differential privacy for certain kinds of things. But for the most part, data brokers, which in my view are the kind of paradigmatic case of why the data economy is so toxic, give the idea and say that they're anonymizing data. And that has been shown to be largely misleading, because the data that data brokers have is especially valuable the more personal it is. So it's true that in some cases they sell lists of people and that they are anonymized in the sense that there are no names in there. But researchers have shown that it usually takes between 2 and 3 data points to identify someone. And that can be things like where you live and where you work. There's usually only one person who lives and works where you do. But it can be other things like where you were and what you bought with your credit card number, or even very subtle things like how quickly does your battery drain on your phone and what patterns does it produce? Because only even that can identify a phone, because only you have the precise number of apps that you do and you use them in the way that you... Yeah, exactly, fingerprinting. So very often these claims are very misleading. Another kind of very misleading claim is when companies that collect genetic data say that they can anonymize data. That's like the epitome of the deception, because obviously genetic data by its very nature cannot be anonymized. Right. It identifies you as one and the same person.
It is literally you.
It is literally you. So right now we have this situation in which 23andMe is going bankrupt. It's about to be delisted from the stock market. The board of directors have quit, except the CEO. And the CEO has said that they are thinking about selling the company. And what is the most valuable asset they have? The personal data of 15 million people. And who are they going to sell that data to? Who knows? But it could probably be either an insurance company or a data broker.
Now, Google has actually tried, and I find this fascinating. In the last couple of years, they have tried to come up with a privacy-preserving advertising model. They started with this flock thing, and then it became topics, and it's now part of this privacy sandbox thing. But I think it's, at least from an academic standpoint, interesting that they're trying to find some way to perhaps keep the data on your browser, keep the real-time bidding of things happening locally. I'm not sure how much you've looked into this in particular, but they're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too. What do you think about some of those technologies? Do they have promise, or is it just another case of putting lipstick on a pig?
Well, many of the iterations have been very questionable. So in some cases, the idea was to put people together in blocks, but those blocks, arguably some of them were quite specific, and so it was still possible to identify people. Another concern was that what Google was doing was blocking other companies from getting the data, but still holding the data themselves in some shape or form. Mm-hmm. And so the concern was that it's questionable whether it's privacy preserving enough. And furthermore, it's like Google is just defending its monopoly, essentially. So to me, companies like Google, but also, of course, Meta, just have not relinquished the idea of ads that surveil. They have not proposed contextualized ads. And so at the end of the day, I think they're not serious about privacy.
So one of the conceits that we have, certainly in the US, is we've relied heavily on this notice and consent model of privacy, and which is to tell them what you're doing and give them the option to say no. And most companies claim to care deeply about our privacy and say that the power's always been ours to control the data we use. Kind of like Dorothy clicking the ruby slippers to go home. Why has this notice and consent model been such a colossal failure?
Yeah, it has been a colossal failure. The idea of consent comes from the field of medicine. And in the field of medicine, it's typically thought that consent is the best way for patients to protect their autonomy. And so the idea is that when you go to the doctor explains what you have, they explain what the possible courses of action are, and then it's up to you to decide which one is best for you. But of course, consent doesn't work in the world of data, because consent has to be informed and it has to be voluntary for it to be appropriate. And in the case of data, even a data scientist cannot possibly explain to you what your data is going to be used for because it gets sold all the time. So you don't know who's going to have it in 10 years' time, and you don't know what kind of analyses are going to be possible. Precisely the allure of big data is that you can come up with inferences that you would have never thought about, that are complete surprises. So you might infer that people who, I don't know, who eat a particular kind of fruit, I don't know, have this particular kind of health pattern. And you can't infer that, you can't know what the inference will be. So consent cannot possibly be informed. And that's even a data scientist. But for most people, data is so abstract that most people are not aware, for example, that when they share their music tastes, they're actually sharing their sexual orientation and other kinds of sensitive information. So consent is not informed in the case of data, but it's not voluntary either, because you don't have a real choice for the most part. A lot of companies have consent conditions in which you either say yes or you don't use the product. And many people can't afford not to use the product. If you want to be a full participant in your society,
right, yeah,
you have to use certain kinds of platforms to interact with others, and there's not much of a choice. And so that's two things. But furthermore, we interact with so many web pages and with so many services that it's a complete cognitive overload. If you actually read the privacy policies of all the companies you interact with, you'd do nothing else. You wouldn't have a job, you wouldn't have friends or family, you would just read terms and conditions. So it's a failure from every point of view, essentially.
Well, and it's given the rise to these things called dark patterns, which is basically more and more clever ways to get you to either agree to something or agree to something you don't know what you're agreeing to, or once you've agreed, not being able to disagree. It's a whole new marketplace of techniques to get you to do these things.
Yeah, the default is to have a design that is incredibly misleading, and to use colors that will make you attracted to say, yes, collect my data instead of no, and to make it difficult to say no.
And you say that, but it's so true. I mean, we do this A/B testing, right? They've gone through all this research to try this with 1 million people, find the ones that are actually get the most uptake, and they refine it constantly and in real time in a lot of cases to maximize the number of people that quote unquote consent.
Yeah, so you are sitting there all alone, making a decision, completely overwhelmed by life. And on the other side of the screen is a complete army trying to get you to do what they want and trying to hijack your dopamine system and trying to mislead you in every way. So the illusion is that you have control and you've made a decision, but really there is a huge asymmetry of power.
So some people have suggested that we give people control over their data and let them sell it as they wish. Treat it like a commodity, like oil or gold. But you say personal data should be treated more like toxic waste. So what's the flaw in this like data sovereignty argument, and why is personal data toxic?
Yeah, I think that's a terrible argument. And it's particularly bad because it's so attractive and because it's so intuitive. And so that makes it quite dangerous. Because we live in capitalist societies, we're very respectful of private property. So it makes sense to think that if you allow people to sell their own data, then that's being very respectful of personal data. But personal data is nothing like private property. For one thing, it tends to be collective. So if I sell my house, then it's only my house. But if I sell my personal data, it probably has personal data about you too, given that we have corresponded. And it has personal data about my family, and it has personal data about people who live nearby me, and it has personal data about people who share some of my psychological traits. So why should it be up to me to sell personal data that is actually exposing other people? So that's one of the major problems. But personal data is also collective in the sense that when I sell my personal data, you might pay the consequences as well. So if I sell my personal data and a company uses it to come up with ways to sway an election, then all of the citizenry suffers. So in that sense, it's similar to ecological damages. So I might pollute, but you're going to suffer the consequences as much as anyone else, even if you're perfect and recycle and are very, very aware of ecology.
And honestly, that is one of the things that your book crystallized for me that I think I maybe was very vaguely aware of, but it really brought it home. And it was really one of the most mind-blowing parts of the book is that, and I to this day, I say that privacy is a we thing, not a me thing. Just like security is a we thing, not a me thing. But in terms of privacy, your privacy affects my privacy. And when I start giving some of the same examples you do, I find that to be one of the most compelling arguments for other people that don't care about their personal privacy. And then I, of course, bring up the Snowden quote that I love, which talks about how rights are not something you have to justify or fight for. They just are. And it's up to the people trying to infringe the rights that have to justify why they're, infringing your rights. And just because you don't care about that personal right doesn't mean that it doesn't matter for everybody else, and you shouldn't fight for it strictly on the reason that as a collective good, the privacy is something that helps all of us. And it's a fundamental part of the fabric of democracy and society that you need to be thinking, at a higher level about, not just about yourself.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think it was Joseph Raz who argued that if you had to choose between having a right like free speech and not having that right, but making sure that everybody else does, it's the kind of right in which you might have an interest that others have the right to free speech, even if you don't have it. So it's even more important that others have it than you have it. So if you're not a journalist, you might not care that much about free speech, but you certainly care that other people who are journalists can have that right, because it's going to inform you as a citizen. And so in the same way, it's very important for you to have privacy. But even if it weren't, because say you're in a very privileged position and you feel very safe, it's even more important to you that other people have privacy. Because if other people have privacy, there's no confidentiality between journalists and sources, between lawyers and clients, between doctors and patients. And pretty soon, democracy starts eroding.
We've been fighting against privileged access by law enforcement to our private digital communications since we've had them, basically since the crypto wars of the 90s. Why do asymmetries in knowledge lead to asymmetries in power? What is it about our public institutions who seem to jealously guard their own secrecy, but expect private citizens to submit to radical transparency and mass surveillance?
I think every institution has a very strong instinct for self-preservation. Every institution wants to protect itself and wants to justify its existence and wants to claim that it is very important, because if it disappears, then the people there have to find a new job. So, and in the same way, every person has an instinct for self-preservation. And so when it comes to power, we've known for a long time that there is a very close link between knowledge and power. So already Francis Bacon argued that the more you know about someone, the more vulnerable they are to you. And then afterwards, Michel Foucault argued the contrary as well. The more power you have, the more knowledge you have. And it's not only that power gives you access to knowledge, which is partly true. So if you have power, you have money. If you have money, you can go to universities, you can buy books, you can buy newspapers. But it's also that if you have enough power, you get to decide what counts as knowledge. So a company like Google gets to decide what counts as knowledge about Carrie, because they get to decide which boxes you are categorized in. And sometimes those boxes are wrong or just factually incorrect. And if you don't even know about it, you can't even contest it. And you will be treated as that category, whether it's correct or incorrect.
Many big tech CEOs over the years have famously uttered some version of privacy is dead, get over it. I think one actually said something very close to that, but the rest of them have implied over the years in public statements that, this is a new world and privacy is, as you knew it, is gone. And that's a good thing. Are we in danger of normalizing mass surveillance? Maybe this is a little bit over the top, but I'm kind of worried about the younger generations who have only known a world with social media and ubiquitous tracking. Like, what happens when no one alive remembers what it was like to have real privacy?
I worry about that too. And it's essentially an experiment because we don't know. We haven't had that world before. And part of the experiment is, again, going to that very fundamental question: how much surveillance can democracy take? And we're really testing those limits. So there are good news and bad news. The good news is that we still have a lot of privacy, and people have been saying that privacy is dead for pretty much centuries. And we have a lot of privacy first because it's still the case that most of our life is analog. Even if you're always online, even if you have your phone on you, most of your conversations are still analog. And interestingly, most of what people buy, they still buy face to face. Now, the bad news is that we have definitely increased dramatically the amount of personal data that we're collecting, and that trend is not stopping and it's not slowing down. So we definitely have a lot less privacy than we had 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And what you say about young people is particularly concerning because it's very hard, I think, for most young people who have grown up under surveillance to even imagine what it's like not to be surveilled and why it's important.
Right.
I think sometimes when we lose very valuable things, it's possible to not even notice what we lose, even when we experience them, much less when we've never experienced it. So I had an experience not too long ago. Somebody invited me to give a talk, and when I got there to give a talk, there was a camera and a microphone, and I said, I'm really sorry, but this wasn't part of the deal. You never told me that I was going to be recorded. And so the organizer frantically looked through the emails. And in fact, I had never been asked whether it was okay to record it. So he turned the video off, but wasn't happy about it at all. And then we had a great session, very interactive. And he very kindly and a bit sheepishly came up to me after the talk and said, this is probably the best session we've had, and I wonder if it was because the cameras were off. And wow. he was somebody who had experienced the world before cameras, but maybe their students had never had a class that hadn't been recorded.
Wow, that's really interesting. I've heard anecdotal stories of kids today, and I've got two daughters that are just out of college, but I think even they're maybe older than where some of this is coming from. Younger kids actually shunning like technology and actually trying to get some of their life back. And I don't know if that's a real trend or not. Have you seen anything like that? Has there been any sort of techlash? Has there been any sort of taking back your privacy notion? Maybe it's not a privacy thing. Maybe it's just a shunning of social media. But do you foresee a time when we might actually push back against this for one reason or another?
It's up to us. I think it's too speculative to try to predict the future. And I don't like it because if I say yes or no, I seem to give the impression that the die has been cast. And it hasn't. It depends on us. So it depends on what we want. But in history, we definitely see a trend that when authoritarianism rises, there tends to be a backlash. However, once you have this much surveillance, it becomes harder and harder to defy power. Because I remember having a lot of conversations with Spaniards about the time of Franco and their methods to communicate, to resist, to challenge, to hide. And while they were telling me their stories, I was thinking none of this would work today. And so we are making it a lot harder to defy authoritarian tendencies. But going back to young people, yes, there are some interesting stories about young people trying to get back some of their data and get back some of their analog life. And one example that I cite in Privacy is Power is the example of a group of young people who share an account and live in different places around the world, and they all use the same account. And so for the people tracking them, it's harder to know who is who and where do they live and what are their patterns. And in general, with my own students, I'm seeing a lot of it. But I wonder how representative my students are. I teach at Oxford. These are people who are studying philosophy and computer science. So potentially not the most representative part of the population. But sometimes I'm shocked that I ask young people what social media they use and they say nothing. And I'm like, okay, so what shows do you watch? No shows. And I'm like, what do you do? Because they don't read either. So some of them are... It's very strange, very different lifestyles. Some of them, they tell me, play role games. Some of them do sewing. It's
really,
it's an interesting crowd.
Well, it's just sewing. I wouldn't have picked that one. Interesting. I think there was, and hopefully I don't get this wrong. I think this was in your book. One of the most astounding examples and really chilling examples of how this could go horribly wrong, all this data collection, was your example of rounding up Jews in World War II, and the difference between, I think it was the Netherlands and France. Could you relay that story?
Yes. So this is in the book, "In Privacy is Power." So the Netherlands had this guy called Lenz, and he was a pioneer of population statistics, and he had built a system that wanted to track people from cradle to grave, and that is a direct quote. Now, in contrast, in France, the French had made decisions for privacy reasons not to collect certain kinds of data, like whether people were Jewish and like where family members lived and that kind of thing. And there's a study that compares the death rate in the Netherlands versus France. And in the Netherlands, the Nazis found and killed about 73% of the Jewish population, whereas in France it was 25%. And the difference is in the hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, I think that story is that one always blows my mind, and it's you don't think about those. I mean, obviously, when that data was being collected in the Netherlands, they weren't thinking about the Nazis coming through and rounding up people and killing them. They were doing it, I'm sure, probably for research or other purposes that they thought were worthwhile causes, but the impacts of that just were not understood. And I think if we're not careful, we're going to have the same kind of thing here, right? I mean, in the United States, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, your location and some of your personal health data, like, period tracking apps and things like that, took on a whole different significance after that.
Yeah, exactly. However, I am reading right now about the history of statistics, and there is a very close relation between keeping tabs on people and wanting to control them. So one of the arguments I have in my newest book, the academic book, The Ethics of Privacy and Surveillance, is that digitizing something is not neutral. Digitizing leads to surveillance, and surveillance leads to control. Surveillance technologies are definitely not neutral. So when it comes to statistics, Prussia was one of the first countries to innovate in this sense and to start collecting a lot of people's data. And they had data about minorities, but the only minority on which they had very specific data were Jewish people. And of course, that is not a coincidence that years later we find ourselves in the Nazi situation. And with other countries, statistics started to develop to control the colonies. So the empires wanted to know exactly who lived in the colonies and how much they produced so they could tax them. So surveillance has always had this connotation of controlling the population.
Since you've published the book, artificial intelligence, in particular large language models like ChatGPT, have exploded in popularity. And there are many ethical concerns related to AI, as with any disruptive technology. And I know this is something you're looking at now, and we could do probably a whole show on this, but what do you see as some of the most concerning or intractable problems when it comes to AI? And maybe particularly, how will AI systems impact our privacy?
So let's talk first about AI in general, and then let's talk about large language models. Because I'm finding it really interesting that language is changing, and that now when people say AI, they think about large language models. But of course, AI is broader than that. Mm-hmm. So how will AI impact our privacy? At the moment, the kind of AI that we're using is machine learning. And machine learning needs a lot of data, and much of that data is personal data. So right now, when we use machine learning, we are typically eroding our privacy. But AI doesn't have to work like that. And there are reasons to think that if we want an AI that is really intelligent, we're going to have to go beyond machine learning. Because at the moment, even the most intelligent AI is pretty stupid in many ways. And it doesn't generalize, it doesn't learn principles, it needs millions of examples to get something, and even then it gets it in a not very robust way, and you can foil it quite easily. So there are some examples of showing an image of a giraffe to an AI, and you change one pixel, and then the AI says it's a bus. And to us, it's obvious that that's just not the case. So one thing to bear in mind is that it depends on how we design AI. And everything that is technology has been designed by a human being, and therefore it could have been different, and it could be different in the future. And now let's talk about large language models, because they've become such a hot topic. And here there are so many interesting connections between privacy and AI ethics and the models. So one major problem relates to copyright. Then that's not directly about privacy, but it is about rights. Mm-hmm. And these systems have been trained with huge amounts of copyrighted material. Now, there are many lawsuits at the moment. Perhaps the most important one is the lawsuits of the New York Times against OpenAI. So the New York Times is claiming that OpenAI has used copyrighted material to train its systems. And not only that, but sometimes when you ask something to ChatGPT, it will spew out an answer that is word for word a New York Times paragraph, but it won't cite it. And OpenAI's response is that, well, first of all, it's like the New York Times tried to hack the system so that they would get this kind of responses, and that's not the normal response, it's just a minority of cases. To which the New York Times will presumably respond, well, that's like just saying, like, look, I just killed one person. It's not something I do every day. Not a big deal.
Right.
Now, what worries me is that it seems that at the end of the day, the company who's going to win will be the one who has the most expensive lawyers. We'll see. We'll see. So that's one thing. Copyright and whether it's fair, it's a fair use, and whether people are being compensated appropriately. But there are also huge problems when it comes to bias and discrimination. So these systems tend to perpetuate very sexist, very racist ideas, and even in very subtle ways. So there has been a study in Nature recently showing how a large language model will predict different kinds of jobs and different kinds of social status and results for different kinds of people and in racist and sexist patterns. And then we have privacy problems. So the main problem is that these systems have been trained basically on all the data available in the internet. And a lot of that data is personal data. And now in Europe, we have the General Data Protection Regulation. And that law establishes that people have a right to privacy, that people have a right to know what personal data companies have on them, that people have a right that if there's inaccuracies, that the company correct those inaccuracies, and people have a right to ask companies to delete their personal data. Importantly, and arguably, companies like OpenAI are not complying with the GDPR. If you ask OpenAI what data it has on you, it doesn't know, because it doesn't have a track record of the data that it used to train the systems. If you ask ChatGPT something about your life and it comes up with something wrong, and you ask OpenAI to correct it, it won't, it can't. And finally, if you ask OpenAI to delete your personal data, it can't. It would have to delete the whole model, essentially. And here it's like, this is major because we're using these models everywhere and so many companies are using it and they're not compliant with the law. So are we saying that the law doesn't matter? Are we saying that companies are above the law? Should the law adapt to the technology? Shouldn't it be the other way around? This is a huge challenge to democracy.
Well, one of the other points I think is interesting you made in the book is that you make a point to say that not all data collection is harmful, and that can actually be quite beneficial to society if it's done properly, which of course is the huge if. How can we gather highly personal information and glean useful insights while preserving privacy? How hard is that to do, and how is it something that is just an ivory tower thing, or is this something we could really do? Because some of the examples I always think of is like, drug studies, because we're on we're on all sorts of drugs. That's it. We love our drugs. And so having a lot of data on what drugs people are on, and maybe finding out what some of these interactions are, things you could never actually do in a lab, would be helpful. Examining community wastewater, to find out what COVID levels are and things like that. When I'm sure there's DNA in there that you could pick out. There are ways then when a lot of this potentially highly personal data could be beneficial to society. Can we find that compromise where we could get the value without ruining privacy?
So in the book, I have a whole chapter in which I have suggestions of how to fix this. And I have a chapter for policymakers and I have a chapter for individuals. So essentially, it's not one thing that's going to fix everything, but it's a combination of things. So in my view, the most important element is to ban the trade in personal data. Because as long as people can trade personal data, then the incentive will be to collect more of it, even if you don't need it for something valuable, and to sell it to whoever wants to buy it, which might not be the institution with the best interest at heart. And so it's fine for you to give personal data to your doctor. What's not fine is for your doctor to then sell it.
Right.
So if we ban the trade in personal data, we fix a lot of things. But another thing is to create fiduciary duties. So fiduciary duties are relevant when there are professional relations in which an asymmetry of power is inevitable, like doctors and patients. As a patient, you tend to be scared, you tend to be sometimes not feeling very well. The doctor knows a lot more than you do and is in a position of power, but the doctor has a fiduciary duty to you. So whenever there's a conflict between his interests and your interests, they have to defend your interests. So it's not good enough that they want to do surgery on you because they would earn a bit more. You have to actually need the surgery. And in the same way, anyone managing personal data should have a fiduciary duty towards the data holders, data subjects. So it's not good enough that it would be profitable for someone to sell my data. If they're going to share my data because it's going to benefit me, then that's okay. So those are two measures, but I have a list of, I don't know how many, maybe 15 measures or something like that. Basically, we have to create guardrails. It's a little bit like a process of civilization. We're still in the wild west of the digital. And to make life fair and livable, we have to come up with the right rules.
All right. Last question before we go. And I always like to end with some sort of feeling of hope or some sort of call to action, or maybe both. One of the things you end the book with is you implore people to refuse to cooperate with a surveillance society. What are some of the most impactful actions that everyday people can take to manifest a world where our privacy is respected again? And maybe what have you found for people who have already drunk the Kool-Aid but are trying to convince others? What have you found are some of the most convincing arguments to convert non-believers?
One way to put it is that privacy is like a key to your life. And you wouldn't give a key to the front door of your house to just anyone. You wouldn't go around the street just giving copies of your key to the front door of your house. And in the same way, your privacy gives people access to what makes you vulnerable, to what makes you you. So if you give it to your best friends, they will use it to protect you and to get to know you better. If you give it to your loved ones, the same thing. But if you give it to just strangers who don't have your best interest at heart, then eventually it will get misused. And not only against you, but against your friends and family, community, and society. So some of the things you can do, again, I have a whole chapter in the book, and some of them are very easy, some of them are a bit more complicated. First is use products that are privacy preserving. So instead of using WhatsApp, use Signal. Instead of using Google search, use DuckDuckGo. Instead of using Gmail, use ProtonMail. Use a VPN. Proton has one that's excellent, and so on and so forth. But in general, is to notice privacy more. If you want to have a great party, ask your friends not to take pictures and definitely not to upload them. If you want to have a good conversation in class, turn off the microphones and the cameras. If you want to have a really intimate space with your friends and family, keep the phones out. And there's a lot you can do. Once you start thinking like this, there's a lot you can do that it's not a very big sacrifice. And a lot of people think that for change to happen, most people have to act in a certain way, but that's actually false. Even just 5 to 10% of people changing somewhat, not being perfect, is enough for companies to pick up on it. And what we need is to send the message to companies that privacy is actually a competitive advantage, which it is. Because if you get offered 2 products that are the same in every way, except one of them preserves your privacy, would you really choose the other one? I don't think so.
Well, Carissa, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Again, you got to read the book. This is one of the few must-read books that I've ever reviewed. It's a really, really impactful book, and everyone should read it. And give out copies at Christmas to family members as well. Thanks again for coming on the show. And
maybe just to end, sometimes when I say that we should ban the trade in personal data, people think that might be extreme. But actually, when you turn the tables around, what's extreme is to have a business model that depends on the mass and systematic violation of the right to privacy. We've just lost perspective.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you. I had such a great time talking with Carissa. She's an amazing person, and I love the way she talks about privacy and how she explains how important it is. And you really do need to read this book, even if you are already somebody who has drunk the privacy Kool-Aid. It is a really great book, not just to learn more about it yourself and to get different perspectives on it yourself. I have found the book very valuable in giving me ways to explain it to other people who may not be on board yet. So start by reading it yourself. If you liked it as much as I do, buy some extra copies and give it to people for Christmas or whatever as presents, because it really is an amazing book. Now, if you're interested in maybe a more academic treatment of privacy, especially maybe after you've read this one, if you want to go a little bit deeper, get a little geekier on it, she has a newer book called The Ethics of Privacy and Surveillance, which I am in the middle of reading myself right now. But if you want to go further, then that's a logical next step. Carissa also did a TEDx talk. If you'd like to see video, there's a link to that one in the show notes. And for my patrons, as usual, I will have some bonus Q&A with my guest. We talk about some even kind of deeper philosophical issues around privacy, and somehow also managed to work the topic of porn into the topic of privacy. So as usual, the patrons will get that bonus content on Thursday. So again, big thanks to Carissa for coming on the show. It was so great to finally, meet her, I guess. I'd love to meet her in person someday. But I would also very much like to get her back on the show sometime. So I will do my best to make that happen as soon as we can come up with another great topic to talk about. All right, one quick follow-up on the interview. If you heard me talk about the "don't be evil" thing with Google, that was actually a motto that they had adopted early on in the company's lifetime, and it was part of their code of conduct for employees. And there was a big deal made about it when that was removed from there, but they actually just changed it to "do the right thing," which, I guess kind of has the same connotation with a little less edgy maybe or something. I don't know. But there actually is kind of an interesting history about that motto and the role it played at Google. Wikipedia has an article that talks about it, and I've linked to that in the show notes yet again. So if you're curious about that, check that out. All right, it's still not too late to celebrate the 400th episode. We're only 4 past that. I kind of told myself we'd dedicate November to celebrating that, so the time's almost up. But again, I would love to see you post on your social media one of your favorite all-time episodes, and that might be the 400th episode. I don't know. But post one, tag me, and I will be sure to like and repost. I'm really trying to reach more people, and that is a great way to introduce other people to the podcast. All right, so we're wrapping up the end of the year, and I do things a little differently usually about the time December rolls around, and this year will be no different. So I do have another interview for you. I talked to Ben and Tyler from the Easy Opt-Outs company who do data deletion, who Consumer Reports rated as one of the most effective services and was also one of the cheapest. And they are really interesting to talk to about this. So I had that interview with them. That will be coming up in 2 weeks. And then next week, we're going to have a pseudo news show, but it's also going to be one of my Dear Carrie mailbag episodes. You can always send me your questions at dearcarrie@firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com, and I will usually answer the email pretty quickly. But I save those questions for a later mailbag episode where then I share your questions and my answers with the rest of the audience so that they can benefit as well. So I'm going to be doing that next week. I might do that in lieu of a news show, but we'll see. If there's any big news stories, I might try to include those too. But then in December, I usually try to take a break, take the month off. So to that end, I'm going to be doing some best of episodes. Not only best of episodes you've already heard if you've been a long-time listener from the past year, but also for those of you who are not patrons, I'm going to be doing a best of episode of the bonus content, the stuff that only my patrons get to hear. So that'll give you a little taste of what you're missing, and also just give you a little extra stuff from some of the best bonus Q&A that I've done with my interview guests over this past year. So those are coming up soon. I'm also planning to resurrect one of the cooler, more interesting episodes that I've done from the past, kind of a throwback episode. That'll be broadcasting probably between those two. And then that'll pretty much get us on to the new year and we'll be back to normal. I've got a lot of other great interviews already in the pipeline, some that have been recorded, some that will be getting recorded soon. I'll be talking about automated license plate readers with Adam Schwartz from the EFF. I'll be talking with one of the key people on the permission slip app at Consumer Reports, and several others which are in the works, and I don't want to jinx. But suffice to say, I got a lot of great stuff coming up. So subscribe to the podcast, and then you won't miss any of that. All right, that'll do it for this week. Again, happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Take care. Stay safe out there. Enjoy some time with the family. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.